You've all been busy with the exam, and we thank you all for being so active. And we'll, any questions on administrative issues as we continue? I'll make a few comments, but any questions as we start? We're starting the second half of the course, basically, or second part. Okay, let me briefly introduce it, and then if you have questions, follow-ups, we can go to them. The first class had the first section had these 5 theories, in a sense, 5 approaches to community power, to leadership, to etc. What we do now in the second half is look at ways that these work, make them more subtle, combine them, look at examples of different cities in the US and internationally. And we will look then at specific readings that deal with major points that it's important for you today to try to take away from this. For both the urban area and I would say nationally and internationally, as illustrated by the section today on power. How does power work, especially in a political context? That's our topic for today. We especially would welcome more discussion, especially for those of you who are reading, working further on some of these specific issues. That probably includes almost all the MA students who are doing theses, and BA students or third year public policy students who may have a class project or someone else like that may overlap. If there's a way that you might want to join, overlap something you want to write for this course with your paper, we'd love to talk to you about it and can try to help focus that, and then see if there are ways of either finding a paragraph you missed in one of the readings or building in something which can make that connection more explicit. That is, I'd say in general, we encourage you to do 2 or 3 things well, not 10 things superficially. And you have models of each all around you at the USC. And so I'm encouraging more focus to at least on some of them, that you get a sense of the qualities of higher quality of work. Similarly, as we've said, if there any of you are thinking about a little project, not a big paper, a little project you can do in a day or 2, but it may have a new idea or whatever, stay after class and let's talk about it. People have often done that. For instance, two guys got together who didn't know they shared an interest in sports and how sports related to cities and sports stadiums, salaries paid to sportsmen, et cetera, and things of that sort. And that became a very smart, interesting paper based on starting it around the middle of the course. Then they continued it the next quarter, and it got much better still. So next quarter, we'll have a course called Global Local Politics, which will continue some of these same themes globally, internationally. Okay, any questions on any of that? All right, let me then comment on 3 things today. Actually, let me look at the syllabus. Yeah, let me ask someone who's got a calendar. What week are we in? Is this week 4 or 5?
5.
4.
5.
Sorry?
5.
5. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that is the community power section on our syllabus is listed for week 6. And then the next section is week 6 and 7. All right. So basically we got roughly 2 sessions for these community power issues, today and Monday. And they may overlap a little bit. Okay. Let me introduce this with 3 more general points. Why are we talking about this? And I have 3 sections of comments about power and the like. A first critical issue is, how does power work today with some current examples, and how can we sharpen our thinking about them based on either political debates, obviously, in the presidential campaigning, or in critiques of, my mayor didn't do this for COVID and people are dying, or here's a city you ought to move to, and then how's that city different from the place you were, and the like. Uh, Second, how are these core concepts articulated in the readings on the syllabus and the huge debates which they summarize? This was one of the biggest debates in the social sciences in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It continues now. It's not just called community power. It has many different names. It's called regime politics. It's called capitalism. It's called neoliberalism. It's called the new economy, the new democracy, new democratic politics, and new political culture. All these things overlap and have implications for what we're talking about here. And I'm going to focus today more specifically on power as a general term and elaborate it. But I'll link it to these debates from the past. Third, what are the takeaways, key ideas for your future use? What can you have as a short set of things to pull out of from your computer or whatever when someone is sitting across a desk from you, or someone's talking on the tube or writing on social media, and say, hey, that doesn't make sense. Isn't there a way of talking about this and this and this, which he or she should have also added? And I'm drawing on something that I've sometimes called the 16 faces of power. So there's 16 different, I'm telling you, we're building up to this. There's 16 dimensions of power that we're going toward, and I'll make them more explicit probably next time. Okay. I and many others have studied power locally because it's a better way to do so rather than trying to capture it nationally or globally. Why? Because of one, because people lie more nationally. They get caught more. It's harder to access them. The stakes are bigger for some, and they're very subtle about it. Second, because there are huge variations in local units. So we're now studying, we got data for over 10,000 units around the world, 35 countries. And we got questions that capture some of the things I'm talking about now. These variations in the local units within the US and internationally illustrate multiple combinations of money, votes, violence, success, failure, gender change, and more. All kinds of things which we wouldn't have thought about, except because San Francisco is so much this way, Waco, Texas is so much that way. But you get someone who does a PhD or a book on one of these places, and you say, hey, how's it work in Waco if it works that way in San Francisco, et cetera, such as being gay 20 years ago, and then how that changed. Plus cities with more capitalist or socialist economic systems, which used to be, at least in theory, a simple definition or simple labeling. It's gotten more complicated within China, within Scandinavia is held up as a classic democratic welfare state. Yugoslavia in the past was seen as a blending of these. Guinea in Africa, French West Africa, where I worked for 4 months. All these things have combinations of these analytical elements, which make them more fascinating and complicated. But the answer, one way, is to try to get some systematic evidence about how and why they work, and then to say what makes them stronger or weaker. Notice I'm not saying better or worse. I'm trying to look at what goes with what and why in a more analytical framework. A bigger point here is that the core concepts of power we use in most domains, from the family to social organizations like churches and unions, to city governments, national societies, emerge from this community power literature we're reading in this section, and that most people, even social scientists, do not realize the importance or specificity of these concepts. Some of them either ignore them, or they overgeneralize or misunderstand how power works in ways that were sharpened in these big debates among a lot of smart people who criticized and built on each other, from Dahl to Parsons to Max Weber and so forth. Business has been used a lot as a classic example because from Marx onward, business was seen as a specific driver of policy nationally, locally, internationally with Lenin. And so where and how business was part of power has especially been analyzed and debated in ways that which leads me today to use more examples from business as this continues as ever to be central in a lot of debate. Take the label that Donald Trump, okay, so I'm now starting with a couple of contemporary examples. Donald Trump, as a presidential candidate in 2016, referred to his opponent as, most oftenly, begins with C. CH, what was CH referring to? Corrupt Hillary. Okay, he was trying to label her in a way that made a difference. The main rationale when he would refer to was that she gave speeches, and I cite this because it's been discussed 1,000 times. She gave speeches to Wall Street firms for which she was paid royally. One reason is that Wall Street is a symbol of capitalist global leadership and national as well as nationally, but the label does not point to a single bank or person or firm. It implies that they have a corrupting effect on a political candidate for office. Okay, let's examine that, but especially the place idea of Wall Street. The same kind of reasoning is used in more historically distant studies. For example, in Robert Dahl's book, Who Governs? In the early sections of the book, he has historical chapters on the 19th century New Haven, and he especially stresses ethnicity, to some degree income, but basically everybody was more or less middle class. They were small farmers. They tended to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They didn't talk much about inequality because they were all sort of equal. In the end, by the end of the 19th century, you had in New Haven and nationally these huge empires of money, the railroads, Wall Street firms, oil, petroleum refinery, names like Ford, Rockefeller. They built massive mansions in Manhattan, and this led in turn to a huge anti-capitalist, anti-elite kind of reaction, which continues in various ways today. It led to creation of the income tax. But the point I'm making, I'm embellishing it, but the simple point I'm using here to point to is a label like Wall Street or WASP or Catholic immigrants or Italians, or Dahl sometimes talks about the new plebes, new plebeians, to cover many generally Catholic ethnic groups. He doesn't use the label I'm pointing out for one or two of you, Irish, but if you read closely, the Irish were the first major set of ex-plebes and continued on. And the hero of the book, the current mayor at the time he wrote, was Irish Catholic. As the numbers of these so-called minority groups became more numerous, they nevertheless could become a leadership in some of the states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. And so you had battles between the state level legislatures and individual cities with the older, more rural areas. And this continues in the debates between the Senate and the House in the US today, as you see daily in the news. One way of labeling what Dahl did, in which he and then others started to use more explicitly then, was positional. That is, people who are in the position of working on Wall Street or being a city council member in New Haven and being Irish Catholic, these positions were a way of trying to identify who held power. And so the implicit idea was that if you're on Wall Street or you're in the city council and you are Irish Catholic, and most of the others are Irish Catholic, or at least they're Catholics. The implicit idea was that Catholics are different from Protestants. Wall Street is different from Main Street, and that tells you about power. Okay, what Dahl did was so we're going to get into criticism, but let me wait just a minute and just say that many people for years did that and still do this. And sometimes this is the only thing you can get, especially if you're dealing with the historic past, or you're dealing with people who are dead, or you're dealing with a far off country. In the old days of the so-called Iron Curtain, people used things, they didn't know the names, they didn't know who these people were. They tried to get anything from the sources they could find. The second general approach has been termed, with various meaning, reputational. And it makes more explicit that it makes explicit the degree to which it's not a direct, but instead an indirect indicator of power by going through the idea of reputation of a firm or institution, like the Supreme Court, or things which are more general. And I'm going to just give a few examples just to stress the generality, but we'll come back to more specifics. Leaders obviously seek to enhance, some in different ways, seek to enhance their reputations by say acting forcefully, pounding the table, shouting, or in campaign photographs. I had a terrific MA a few years ago of the Russian President Putin as a candidate in his campaigns. He had terrific campaign things. He would ride a motorcycle or drive a tank wearing no shirt, maybe a hat or a helmet, but no shirt, sitting up straight, looking very tough. He commissioned a film called I Love Putin, and I think the Sleeping Beauty was woken up by a kiss. I've forgotten what it was. He had calendars printed with Putin dates and photos. Okay, I'm just using this because it goes a little further than most of you are used to. Or let's say if we look at the mayor who ran for president of Colombia, Mokas, who was this brilliant character, he was the opposite of Putin. He was very, very discreet, humorous, self-abdicating, and he was once in a debate where his opponent said, "Justice sociale, justice sociale," and Mokas never said anything like that, and his staff thought he'd lost the debate because it was in a poor neighborhood with poor people, and Mokas didn't do that. The opposite. They did surveys. They found that Mokas had won. What I'm implicitly introducing here is the idea of authenticity and of differential ideal types or scenes or issue areas, which all are ideas which stress the importance that there are different rules of the game in different contexts. That's a big idea that we want to stress as we proceed, but I'm just introducing it here with the differences by city. Floyd Hunter, Hunter, used what Dahl and what others later called the reputational approach. This is a more specific version than what I just talked about with Putin. But in Atlanta, they asked a question which was very simple. Who is most powerful here in Atlanta? Who's powerful? They didn't define power. They didn't ask for anything else. They just said, who's powerful? And then he drew a circle, Floyd Hunter, and he connected people with lines. And this was an early version of what's later been called network analysis. And there are a lot of people who do the network stuff. But it also illustrates that if you have garbage in, you get garbage out. If you don't really know what power is, you don't know what those lines mean. And more importantly, different respondents can use different criteria. There's maybe nothing wrong with their own criteria, but if you don't explicitly articulate the distinctiveness of the criteria, and ask about them, then you don't get the specificity of the potential answers. And that was one of the major contributions of Dahl and Who Governs, of introducing the concept of issue area. Major point there. Similarly, participants in these political systems recognize that you may have potential. Sorry, let me just say, add one more point first. Connections or networks among people are another way of imputing power that has been widely used and still is. Many papers in the American Sociological Review, for example, people who serve on corporate boards of directors who are also active in a government or on different boards, or city council members, are often criticized as making government policy that may have a conflict of interest with their business interests. Donald Trump is again classically criticized for not selling or distancing himself from his family and personal business while simultaneously serving as president of the US, whereas in the past, traditionally, that was a norm, that you would divest or distance yourself dramatically from your own economic interests. People who see the centrality of networks see this as determining the policy. You hear the multi-causal non being mentioned in that sentence. And you know about multi-causality now. Next big concept, interests or and these are overlapping. I'm using very loosely just to introduce them together. Interests, values, preferences, ideology, norms have been classically played down and especially in openly and explicitly materialist interpretations, such as the Marxian idea of substructure determines much of the superstructure, or the current label of neoliberalism, which is applied to ideas or policies suggesting that it is an explanation of why people do things and it is meaningful. Neoliberalism is generally used to imply that money or the economy of a capitalist society constrains the values and programs. A stronger, more specific label is by Thomas Friedman, New York Times writer, did a famous book called The World is Flat. He talked about the golden straitjacket. The golden straitjacket was something that political leaders in the contemporary capitalist world must wear if they want to be economically successful. So the idea is that this so constrains you that you don't need an ideology. And he explicitly says, I'm not going to talk about values. I'm not going to talk about programs, but he does bring in this physical image in ways that have a similar function metaphorically. This opens a door to lots of things which we started talking about in the last section, discussing artists, discussing also innovations, and the idea that instead of just the 19th century Marshall idea or Marx or Marshallian version of neoclassical economics of land, labor, capital, and management, instead we've also got ideas, human capital, and how these are used. And that brings in interests and preferences more explicitly. Talent. The strongest simplistic alternative, of course, was at least the label of Hegelian idealism, where ideas drive the material world, or at least define the context of this era, an historical period, so much so that it constrains how things work. And it got reified a bit more when Marx, so-called, turned Hegel on his head in inventing what Engels termed historical materialist, or Marx in turn discussed as false consciousness. Note, to bring this in shows that Marx was totally conscious of the idea that ideas could change the substructure, but it was done falsely. It was violating the rules of history, which Marx stressed. And so how to bring this in shows that he saw the importance, but his classic example was, who knows? And how does it link to Chicago politics as we've talked about it? 4-letter word, 5-letter word, Irish. He said the Irish workers should join with their English counterparts and fight against capitalism. And they're simply joining these nationalist parties, which is false consciousness. Okay, obviously the reference are far broader than that, but the concept is still widely used, but it articulates the importance of joining and looking for potential conflicts. It also makes explicit in the way the term neoliberalism does not. Marx, in that sense, was invoking false consciousness to say, be careful. Neoliberalism is too simple, too simplistic. I'm obviously speaking for him here, but I'm showing that Marx is an analyst. He wrote also for a New York newspaper. When he wrote about journalistic stuff for New York newspaper, he didn't talk about the 3 stages of history or something like that. He was very sensitive to nuances. Nevertheless,
Professor,
it's led obvious. Sorry?
Professor, I was just wondering if you could touch a little bit more on what you mean when you talk about false consciousness.
Okay, for sure. Anybody want to give it a try? Anybody had a course on Marx? I think I had 6 courses on Marxism in my day, so I guess I take it too much for granted. False consciousness is, and to make it a little simple, acting in a way that Marx did not prescribe as advancing history. So consciousness is saying things, doing things. I want this. I want to revolt. I want to join a union. I want the union to fight against the English labor union, or I want to fight against the management. And that choice to fight against the management, against the English by the Irish workers, Marx said, was false because it didn't fit with his implicit, or what he called, others later called, the rules of history, that in order to move from capitalism, you have to advance to socialism. Before you can get to socialism, you need a communist revolt, or let's say a revolt, and it would be led by the proletariat. And if the proletariat does not organize into unions and fight politically and advance capitalism to its own self-destruction, then you can't advance, and therefore unions should join with one another and fight together against capitalists through, and again, a major concept was class consciousness. And so if people did not actively use and articulate class consciousness, they had false consciousness. That's the Marxian concept. Is that clear enough? Okay,
Yes,
take a look on Wikipedia, and you can, or books, and you can find, lots more. But that's the core idea. Max Weber, coming a little later than Marx, was growing up surrounded by lots of Marxian debate and discussion within the German Social Democratic Party, in the media, universities, etc. And he spent much of his career developing sort of a framework which did not seek to refute Marx. He didn't really attack Marx. What he tried to do was build a broader set of contexts which would say, where and why would a Marxian dynamic work, and where would it not? And not to make these up, but to go out and do, as he did, a separate book, where one on, say, the Protestant ethic, which many of you have read, the second on ancient Judaism, of how the ancient Jews differed from Syria, the Persians, and the others around them, from Egypt, and how these distinctive characteristics led to different evolutions. The Religion of India, The Religion of China, in 2 major volumes, which showed how each of these were different contexts that changed the whole rules of the game. Okay, so basically, he then went on, and this is on a reading list for this section, and he distilled his concepts from these more empirical studies. And so one of the most famous is called Class, Status, and Power. And he would talk about class, as I just have, basically following Marx. He then added a new concept, which he stressed, called status. And status was very broad for him. It could include gender, hairstyle, occupation, but seen from the standpoint not of money or linking to the resources of production, as in Marx, but instead being something that people would defer to, would respect. And power was then what happens within yeah, sorry, Alejandro, anything very quick? Yeah, I'm teaching the class right now. So connect and see if you can. Zoom, it's on the syllabus. Okay. Let me ask Gray, are you making a copy, ideally video and audio?
Yep, we'll have a video up on YouTube after class.
Okay, no, not I'm saying making of this class right now.
Yep, Andy.
Yeah, we want to try to do that each time as a backup in case Andy forgets or makes a mistake. That's why I'm talking about this. That I sometimes do it myself, which is why I get mucked up with phone calls like this. Okay, because that shuts off my backup. Okay. Since Max Weber, many have recognized the interpenetration of both ideas and material interest in multiple different ways that we continue in scenes, in issue areas, the doll idea, and in things like authenticity and legitimacy. In one domain, like building a hospital, or the perspective on building a hospital, which may be seen as an economic activity of getting money, borrowing, getting loans, contracting out, hiring a construction firm to build the hospital. A second dimension is to say, is this being done in terms of criteria for egalitarian hiring of workers, or say affirmative action, and that who may work on building the hospital? So it may be the same physical activity, material activity, but we can have different criteria for their evaluation. And so Max Weber began sort of articulating that kind of thing, that the people who were shouting at the gates of Versailles that they were starving to death, and the famous reply of Marie Antoinette, let them eat croissant, was not about production. It wasn't that they were peasants, it was they did not have consumption. So I cite that as an example that that does not fit with the normal Marxian definition, but Weber stressed this, that conflict can be over consumption. And then the next stage was Ralph Dahrendorf, who said any conflict group can be a class. And so we now have in the social sciences all kinds of meanings and discussions of class and status in ways that overlap. Smokers and non-smokers are a class. And then I remind you that I'm not favoring personally any of these examples or the normative criteria within them, but trying to articulate them to make you self-conscious that you can try to see what's legitimate for the Irish ethic and what's illegitimate, and where these can criticize each other, or the concept of clientelism, rather than calling, he didn't call her clientelist Hillary. He called her corrupt Hillary, making it a label in that way. A further social science step in studying community power is not to study one city, but to compare and in that way more easily contrast the context. So New Haven versus Atlanta, Chicago versus New York. And this led to about 166 case studies in the US alone from the 40s to the 70s. And some of us started analyzing these by comparing the individual cases, and we still do. But the methods often used, I mentioned people in Atlanta who were said, who's powerful? As people use different methods in different studies, that led to sometimes very different results. So the this in turn led some of us to develop comparative studies. And maybe if it's handy for you, I guess it's Andy, if you want to try to show now the three or four columns, we can show those. As what I'm saying is now beginning to fill in some of these, and we can go back and forth. So apologies for the messy handwriting. If I'd done it on a blackboard, you could forgive me. This is mine. Can we make it a little bigger in any way, Andy, or is that not easily possible? Or I guess each of you on your own screen can maybe make it a little larger. But there we go. Yeah, that's great. Good. And back up a little bit because we lost the label of the columns, I think, didn't we? Back up a little smaller just to see the. Yeah, no, see, no, we lost the first column. It's the label. No, it's cut off. It's cut off probably in what I sent to you. It's probably my mistake. So I apologize. Okay, so I'll talk about it. This gives you 4 columns. Traditional elitists like Mosca and Pareto, or Dahl's history chapter. Second is Hunter, 1953 Community Power Structure book. Third is Dahl, 1961, Who Governs. Fourth are comparative studies of community power, such as the paper Who Governs, Where, When, and with What Effects. Okay, so these are the 4 different ways of looking at and analyzing power. And there are questions. Look at my own copy here for a second. It's not cut off. Okay, skip it. All right, you see here things I've been talking about: positional, reputational, decisional in these 3 columns. And above them, base resources. Base resources are things like money or the laws which you govern by if they are known. So people say constitutional lawyers will put a lot of focus on what does the law say that you can do if you're a Supreme Court justice or a senator. These are base resources for those people like Hunter and Dahl and others who say, you know, people follow the law in 1,000 different ways and don't just look at the law or the Constitution. You won't understand what decisions are being made. So in that sense, the law is a base resource. Sometimes the term power is used to more narrowly to refer to the Hunter column, and then influence, Dahl sometimes used contrasting influence with power. But I'm not going to try to stick with that except to point that out that these may be used differently. What we did in the comparative studies where it says all 3 was to look at all three of these concepts, base resources, power, and influence, and asked explicit questions about each so that we could then contrast the degree to which the one was related to the next or not, and then to say how much are these overlapping or non-overlapping in Waco compared to Boston, compared to San Diego. And that's where things get more scene-like, as you've seen illustrated in that work. But this is the background growing out of these kinds of concepts. And the methods then used to simplify were positional. We're now in the third row, sorry. Positional, reputational, decisional. And these abbreviations are open-end reputational, closed-end reputational, and decisional. The big concept, which I haven't mentioned here, but which you may have read a little bit about, is that what Dahl did, this is one of his main methodological points, was to critique Hunter and again, but his main idea was that you don't want to use just what people say. You want to see what do they do and how do specific changes to the in that issue area get implemented or not. So the way that we would put this would be, that is, in trying to put this into explicit questionnaires that could be used not just in Atlanta or New Haven by one person, but by doing this initially with 51 and then 62 cities across the US in ways that would be done comparably. And as we saw these huge differences in results, we began to stress more and more how comparability was a critical component of even theory building before you could know if Atlanta was different from New Haven or not, because those two books and many of the 166 were written as if this is the way the world works, whether it's national or international or local. I'm studying democracy, or I'm studying totalitarianism or business leadership or whatever. Okay. So Dahl's questions included things like who initiated the decision? Whose idea was it at the beginning? Who supported it? Who supported, what names of people? What were the names of those persons who backed this idea, such as John Smith should run for mayor? Who opposed? Who were the opponents of this idea? Individuals and organizations. What were the coalitions around them? Who fought? Who joined which group? Who mediated among these competing groups? Who tried to bring them into their office or have a party with bringing them together and say, how can we mediate among you people who say you're fighting against each other, but maybe you can combine and we can do things together. And then who prevailed, who won, at least in this one round of the decision. So those specific steps were a critical conceptual idea that led to this methodology that Hunter was seen as missing because he just said, who's powerful? And powerful could mean banking, it could mean economic development, it could mean elected the mayor, it could mean being on the school board, or whether or not you have a recess at 5 o'clock or 2 o'clock, or how long is the recess in the school. Each of those are different, very different issue areas. And so stressing the issue area through these kinds of questions was a major idea that Dahl stressed. Then, in terms of results, the next column, elites were seen as the identity elites were seen as were basically stressed. That is, you're a WASP farmer in New Haven, therefore you have these interests, therefore you think and act this way. This is explicitly contrasted by Hunter, who would then say, who's powerful? Hunter differed from the positionalists in asking those questions. Tell me, please, there are 10 bankers in town, which one is most important? And so if 10 people or 20 people all say Chase Bank is most important, then the Chase Bank president, that's the person who has the powerful reputation. He's powerful. Dahl says garbage. Maybe he's powerful for giving you a Chase credit card, but maybe he can't do anything beyond that. Does he have any impact on selecting the mayor? Does he set the rules of the superintendent of schools? We don't know if we don't ask. Okay, so Dahl then labeled this pluralism in the sense that there is no one actor dominant like, quote, business or banker, but instead we may have different kinds of actors, banker or business or a mayor, in different issue areas. This in turn we incorporated in the comparative studies, but we took it a step later and added other concepts like the degree to which one leader was political or business or something else, the degree to which power was centralized in a hierarchy, a pyramid, or instead was broken up into lots of little baby pyramids, or flat, say in an ideal, totally egalitarian commune where everyone does the same kind of work, everybody washes the dishes, everybody does this and that and the like. You have no, so these conceptions of egalitarianism feed into things which we tried increasingly to measure, to conceptualize first as system characteristics and then to measure them so that we could say Atlanta is more centralized, hierarchical, and business dominated than New Haven was. Okay, historically then, the picture in the bottom shows that these patterns changed from the Linds, Robert and Helen Lind, in their book on the reading list, which historically was one of the first studies of community power. Really, there were two, Middletown, and then the second follow-up was called Middletown in Transition. In the transition book was written in the midst of the Depression around 1933. And so it included a much more explicit stress. There was no such stress in the first book. It stressed the dominant business of the town and they were called bell jars. If your grandmother or mother made jars, glass jars of fruit and so forth, they're made, at least they were started in Muncie, Indiana by the Bell Jar family. And that was the dominant family. And it was like Hershey, Pennsylvania, well known for sort of the Hershey bar family dominance of a very small town. And that was the story which they then explicitly discussed in historical materialist terms and talking about Marx and so forth. This in turn led to Marx and being explicitly included in a lot of this work, along with Hunter's book. I'll mention as well, there are other lots of famous books, but one of the most important was C. Wright Mills's book called The Power Elite, which stressed business and government and military as being three pyramids of power. And the US Congress, he said, didn't have any power. They just passed laws and people ignored the laws if they were not inconsistent with the military industrial complex. That was what really drove American policy. Okay, that power elite argument informed a lot of this stuff. Then people began to say, how much are the police representing, in this sense, the military? Are they really dominant? Where and why? How much? And so forth. And I'm showing here these arrows to Hunter, Dahl, Polsby, Wolfinger, Vildovsky, who were students of Dahl and who did books on individual cities or a review in the case of Polsby. And Polsby actually was a grad student here in sociology, and he wrote a chapter on Hyde Park as illustrating these kinds of themes. If you want to read about Hyde Park in this era, and this was then the great debate after this sort of 1961 clash via Who Governs came out. You had all kinds of criticisms, attacks, and so forth. But my point is, these debates led to clarifying the concepts. That was the major contribution for social science, that even though a lot of it overlapped with ideology or personalism or whatever, I said this first, no, you didn't, or this is the really two faces of power, not just decisions. That was a so-called Bachrach and Barrett's Two Faces of Power paper. Oh, you're just studying the behavioral, you're leaving out the reputation, which is really also important. We need to join them both. So in that sense, in our comparative study, we did. We said, let's get a measure of reputation as well as of the decisional, as well as of the position of the person who's speaking. So we had multiple informants there. Let's see. We had Hunter was a graduate student here in the social work school, and he then worked as a social worker in Atlanta while finishing his PhD at the University of North Carolina. He transferred. His style was also lively, and he said, I mean, I was at a couple of conferences with him. He said, I started writing a book. I said, this is boring. So I threw out the whole manuscript. I put it right in the wastebasket. I said, I'm going to write a fun book that people are going to want to read. And that was community power structure. He invented the term. And so the field came from his pen. But he also was very loose, didn't try to define most concepts in any coherent way, and contradicts himself in different sections. He later on said, quote, I was a Stalinist Marxist when I wrote the book, but he didn't write it so explicitly. But he also drew on elite theory from Pareto, Mosca, and others, I would say, as a reader, even if he doesn't cite them. And they were more sophisticated than Hunter, but he innovated. His major innovation was adding the method of the so-called reputational method of asking explicitly, where is power, instead of assuming that you can tell it by the fact that she was elected mayor, seeing where and how the mayor makes a difference or not. This led in turn to the idea of snowball sampling, that if you start with some important people, such as going to a newspaper and just taking the names of the people most frequently listed, or asking a reporter, tell me the 20 most important people in Atlanta, and then you go and interview them, and then you ask each of them, or who else should I talk to who's also important? They in turn mention new names. That's called snowball sampling. Like a snowball, it gets bigger. Whether it's representative and what and who it represents is a different question, I'm pointing out implicitly. But it got used in a number of studies, and it implicitly suggested that people who have power, they can tell you, and we don't know. But I would follow up and say, why should they tell us truthfully? How much is lying, and who and where and why? I mean, we got a lot at stake here. Business dominance was the main story. As I've stressed, there were a few professionals, but the point was that, like C. Wright Mills, Hunter stressed the mayor and the elected officials, they don't really count much, or that is, they follow business interests without saying what business interests are. Social and especially economic status explain politics. The superstructure, substructure was the argument, although these terms were not used explicitly. The Sayre and Kaufman book is on the list as one example of New York as a study that showed somewhat descriptively in New York that there were many different types of decision makers, like pluralism of Dahl. that economics did not dominate, that even the mayor did not dominate city politics as in the form of laws passed by the city government, that no one dominated New York City decision making. This was his main point. He didn't build it up very much as a theory. That was done more importantly earlier than Dahl by Edward Banfield in his critical work on Chicago, several books as a graduate student and then a faculty member here. Political influence was the most important, was for the most serious elaboration to compare to who governs. What was not stressed in New Haven, but was stressed very explicitly by Banfield, was the machine. The political machine was critical, and that how Mayor Daley won was indeed powerful. Powerful? That was the big question. Everybody reading the Chicago Tribune or the Sun-Times said, of course, the mayor does everything. This is Chicago. He's got the machine behind him. Banfield did the same kind of thing as Dahl. Not explicitly, but he went in and talked to lots more people about specific decisions, and they're in separate chapters on the building of the University of Illinois at Chicago, the location of that Circle campus, so-called, the destruction of the Italian neighborhood, which was there first, the choice on where to build a public health hospital. Would it be on the west side or the south side? And all the experts said the need is greatest on the south side, and the other people said, that is the head of the political machine, who was named for the expressway, or the expressway is named for the two generations of Dan Ryan, Cook County Democratic Party leader, not the mayor. The Cook County Party leader said, let's put that hospital on the south side. Sorry, not on the south side. They put it on the west side. And so the south side, it took a couple of decades before there's a smaller version of a public hospital like that. There are only those two really, but they do take in anybody. You can be an immigrant with no passport, no name, you're gunshot, they put you right in the emergency room, and you've got some of the best surgeons in Chicago who love to work there because they get a lot of challenging work all the time. Okay, so there are chapters on these kinds of specific decisions that Dahl conceptualized more abstractly than Banfield. Banfield has some abstractions, but I would say don't waste your time paying too much attention to them. Read the specifics, the subtlety. He's a smart analyst of the specifics. His typologies were too loose and too messy. By contrast, Dahl's concepts were much more useful for us today. Okay, we got 10 minutes or so. Questions? Let me try to at least welcome more from anyone on any topic that we've talked about. I haven't yet introduced the 16 dimensions, which I'll do next time. Silence. I see one name up there. I don't think we've heard from Jie Chen. I see. I think is your camera off? If you have anything you want to bring in, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
How does this relate to anything you've read or thought about in your own readings or personal experience? Or if you're uncomfortable with the camera, that's okay. But if you can turn it on, that would be great.
Okay, so it's early in China, so I decided to turn the camera off.
Where are you from? I'm going to ask more in the second half of the course. Tell us about the towns you're from, and then we'll see if we can compare and learn from each other in the class. What towns did you grow up in?
I grew up in Jiangsu, China. It's place it's like 2-hour ride from Shanghai.
Okay. Mostly that one place?
Mhm.
Yeah, did you then go to university in China or come here?
Oh, I went to university at UCSD.
Okay, San Diego.
Yeah.
Okay, now we'll talk about San Diego. All right, so any contrast between where you lived in China and what you felt with culture shock, perhaps in San Diego? How can you
Um,
contrast those two as places with anything that we've talked about today or anything else that really hit you hard as differences?
I mean, um, when I was in China, there's no like voting culture. So everything is decided by the mayor or like the president Xi. But
Just as a
after I
footnote,
got,
just as a footnote, there are elections at the smaller villages, the small
yeah,
town level. So that, and those have been studied. There's a book on them, and so just to say that you do have both. But go ahead, for sure, that's true of the big cities in the nation. But not, I'm interrupting. Go ahead.
yes. But it's like we got elections in big cities, but we rarely get to like participate in the process.
I'm working with a guy who's a political scientist professor in Wuhan, China, and he's studying right now. And we're talking every week about participation in the political system in China by average citizens. So that's why that this is of interest of where and how it's similar or different. But go ahead. What else did you? How would you notice this concretely, say in San Diego, and how it differed?
It's like I went like for college in 2016, so it's as soon as I got San Diego,
Good
there's like,
timing.
yeah, it's like every professor or like faculty members is like urging you to go and vote, and like every like my suite mate is trying to like express their political opinion. So it's like very different from like we're in China, because there's no like party competition and all sorts of things, and like we rarely notice like how like different like maybe major mayor candidates would do to change our policies. So I feel like the culture to discuss politics in the United States is like more, I don't know, active.
These are very much concepts which it is valuable to have addressed and compared internationally, because you, instead of just talking about New Haven and Atlanta, you can get, well, what if we dropped elections? How much would that change in New Haven and change in Atlanta? And so China and its bigger cities and national government are a powerful case to then say what changes and what does not change, because the social media are super active in China. There's a lot of criticism of the national government and of specific services. And so some have even suggested that precisely because because they're not elections, it may be that people who do garbage collection do a better job than they do in Chicago, for instance. So they're interesting, ironic twists we can pursue on that. But any other observations in the 4 years since you were in San Diego for 4 years, pretty much?
Yeah, like 4 years.
Okay. Any other contrasts that fit with ideas of power or any things that we talked about today that differ across
Um,
nationally?
I don't actually like participate a lot in like maybe the politics in San Diego. So
No, but you don't need to participate. I'm not, I don't mean, yeah, please for definitely do not want anyone to feel they're being put on the spot or say anything about I like or I dislike or I support or I don't support. But we all should be able to talk about everything ideally and be comfortable enough being open that we can discuss these things. Nothing is totally objective, but we can try to talk about them as you did. I mean, everything you said was perfectly clear, and I would say non-ideological, the way you presented it. Such as we can talk about what levels are their elections, how much time do people like your suite mates talk about politics, and that was a shock to you. So that's great news to show how much, even in San Diego, because people from, let's say, Chicago will say, oh, nobody in Southern California talks about politics. All they do is do surfing on the beach.
That's true, though.
You go to UCSD, and what is there at the entrance to the campus? Okay, you got Zooming, airplanes, surfing, etc. So, I mean, the ethos of Southern California is drastically different, and we see in many measures. I interviewed the top aide of Mayor Pete Wilson of when he was mayor of San Diego, and I asked his assistant, "What's the ethnic background of Mayor Pete Wilson?" So he's American like everybody else. That's the San Diego, Southern California style, to deny ethnicity in ways that are the opposite in Chicago, where the 50 wards are consciously created to permit smaller neighborhood groups to preserve in their parades and in their elections of their aldermen distinctive ethnic and other little cultures, regional specific differences. Anybody else want to follow up either with a question as we have here or on anything else in the readings? Alejandro.
Hey, Terry. I have to apologize for that earlier call I had with you. I would like to apologize to my colleagues as well.
Okay.
You mentioned, and I really like this. I believe it was Hunter that said this, and you developed this idea that in America, power is the power elite belongs to these three entities, which is business, government, and the military industrial complex. Now, my question is, since Hunter wrote this in the 1950s, has this changed in any way? Because I also recall, and I'm going to be quoting you, I've been going through the classes that you've taught before in the previous years, and you say that throughout the last few years and this last decade, 60% of business in America does not belong to the big companies and big enterprises, does not belong to GM, does not belong to Ford, does not belong to Walmart, etc. So does that mean that the power within the realm of business has is not that it's been diminished, but it's been distributed amongst a larger amount of people? Does that mean that the power itself, or that the power elite itself, has vanished?
No, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, I think the number of a percentage that I referred to was based not on a power study, but was based on the creation of new jobs. That's the driver of the economy. This is a finding came from David Birch at MIT, that he's the first one who really looked at where does the economy, where do new jobs come from in the economy. He did it first in the US, then he did it internationally, found the same thing in a lot of Europe. But basically, little firms, people start a little firm with 5 people, 15 people. They may leave Microsoft or GM, or they may get fired, but then they'll start a new firm, and the current rates, I think the growth rate of even retail and of total new jobs in the US in the last 6 months is super high. It's amazingly high. Mm-hmm. At the same time that people are getting fired, and because they're getting fired, they're starting new jobs and new little firms. And those new little firms then sometimes get bought up by the bigger ones. Other times they just grow. I mean, such as all the ones that are most in the news, the big tech firms, Apple,
and
Microsoft, Google, Facebook, these were nothing. And there are movies about how they grew out of nothing, you know, college kids at Harvard and so forth. Dell, etc. Oh, they were all dropouts, Harvard dropouts, Dell and etc. But the more general point is in terms of our main theme today, Dahl would say power is only that is economic capital or having a job or being president of a corporation is only a resource. We haven't gotten to that yet. We'll talk about it more, but try to read more of Dahl before Monday and we'll talk further. But the idea is that and his bigger point beyond that is even if you know, and we have precise data on the amount of capital, the number of employees, the percentage of the GNP, we have a lot of those data, but they don't tell us how powerful in terms of politics business is or one type of business is. Actually, we have one quick thing, if it's handy for Andy, could we put that up now and then just as we, if it's easy, otherwise we'll defer until Monday. But
the chart from the textbook?
Yes. No, it's a line chart from the Wall Street Journal yesterday. The Wall Street Journal has a line chart which says how large are the contributions in different business sectors to Biden and to Trump. And a Hunter view would be all the money should go to Trump, to the Republicans. And what does the chart show? It shows it by individual industry. So it's got the pharmaceutical industry. It's got the top line is securities and investment. That's Wall Street. The great bulk of the Wall Street money has gone to Biden, not to Trump. By contrast, look at health. It's the opposite. Look at construction, energy and natural resources, transportation. That money's going to Trump. So in this sense, this shows the degree to which politics does not follow, or at least as the simple measure of political contributions, do not follow business versus non-business. That within this, all these are businesses, but they have very different political engagements. And these are national averages. If we in turn broke this down and included Boston versus Waco versus San Diego versus Pittsburgh, we get much bigger differences within cities in turn. Okay, so that's my more complicated answer, but we're over time. The main point is that these are terrific questions. These are exactly the questions which everybody in this field wants to have answered. But people have, hundreds, thousands of people have fought, written, published, studied, tried to answer more precisely and more compellingly than the people who went on before them, and we're still going with this today. But read on and let's talk about it on Monday. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, if anybody has something quick, stay on it. We can have a brief office hour. Normally it's Monday, but also briefly on Wednesday. Anybody want to ask a question as we collide into office hours, or?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
On the syllabus?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the syllabus, it I think indicates that like a one-page proposal for the paper is due today. Do you have anything to elaborate on that?
Yes, are you a college or grad student?
Undergrad.
Undergrad, okay. For especially for college students, we want to work with you closely. This is automatically an option for grad students, but not for college students. So did you take the midterm?
Yes.
Okay, well, now that's great. If you took the midterm and you're thinking about a paper, that's great. I'd say also it's good to take the final, even if you're a college student and doing a paper. Normally that's required. But we'd like to, but if you're thinking of not taking the final, especially, we'd like to work with you closely on your paper. And so come to office hours, give us emails, and so what you write in the very first doesn't make much difference. But we want to keep working with you. That's the main point. But most of all, we applaud your interest. We want to help you. We want to help you do this. but we want to help you do it in a way that you can be proud of, and we can learn all together.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Stay on if you want to hear maybe people talking like this. I mean, such as Alejandro is a more advanced student, as you can see here. G.A. Chen, do you have anything else you'd like to raise with us?
So I just want to ask about the paper.
Yes, no, please. Yeah, first question, are you a grad student or college?
Grad student, MAP student.
Okay, great. Now that, I think there are about 6 or so of you in the class. So I don't know if you've talked with any of the others, but but we would, as I said at the beginning, we'd love to draw you out also in the class with everybody else as we get to know some of the specifics you're working on. But go ahead about your paper ideas or questions.
So I kind of want to go about like housing policy in Chicago and like how the public opinions and maybe how public opinions would affect Chicago's like housing policy.
Okay, hot topic right now. I'm sitting on a committee with the alderman, Sophia King, in my area, where this is a big issue because we got a massive Michael Reese Hospital area where we're planning to build a lot of housing, billions of dollars worth of housing and other offices, and where and how. And we have on our advisory committee a Black Muslim woman who's saying we got to have more low-income housing for African Americans in Bronzeville. And we don't care about those people who come from, I don't know where, outside Bronzeville. So I hear strongly articulated concerns in these meetings. And for sure, it's a hot issue across the city. And I'm pointing out also implicitly, they're big neighborhood differences, big differences by aldermen. And that makes it a great way that you can study comparatively within Chicago. You can't study all 50, but you could look at some data maybe for all 50 and then look at some data for 2 or 3 individual wards and see how there may be very dramatically different housing policies. For instance, some aldermen are very much in favor of a strong egalitarian policy. We must have lots of housing for the poor. If you build high income housing, you got to have, or that is there's city laws. I think you have to have 20% reserved for low income persons. But you can go higher than that. Or others will say, well, there are ways to try to get around that and so forth. So the degree to which income and ethnicity and locality overlap are very hot right now in Chicago. And some aldermen are, such as my alderman generally is in favor of more low income housing. Other aldermen are the opposite. And they're criticized as gentrifying, for instance. So that word is used in a very ideological way right now. But talking about this, studying it is fine.
Yeah, that's like I was inspired by the Stetson piece that talks about like gentrification and like maybe housing price and all of that. So I kind of want to do like along with like globalization and all things going on, and like the rental housing prices are rising. So I want to see like how this and public opinion would affect like maybe affordable housing programs in Chicago.
Okay, the last part is perhaps the most interesting, but also the hardest to capture. How can you tell what public opinion is? Any thoughts on that?